Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another Lunch and Learn with Michigan's Children. State budget priorities, how Michigan can come together for children and families. Go over a few housekeeping items, and I'm going to kick it to Matt, and we'll get started right away. Welcome. Please feel free to identify yourself. Just put your name, where you're from in the chat, maybe where you're from or the organization that you're representing today. And as a reminder, today's program is being recorded and will be placed on our YouTube page and on our web page for your leisure if you want to go back to it or if you want to share it with somebody who was unable to attend today. If you have any questions, please write them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the session. All right, go ahead, Matt, take it away.
All right, thanks, Stephen, and thanks everybody for joining us. And thanks especially to my fellow panelists here, who we'll get to in a minute. This is chaotic times in Lansing, both in Washington as well, really, but certainly in Lansing, as we're running smack up into two major budget deadlines here. And activity is literally happening as we speak. Late yesterday afternoon, we saw some major movements in the House, and we'll get into some of all that. I just want to lay out kind of before we start the conversation, kind of where things stand, maybe to give people kind of a feel on where we're at, and we'll get into the more information about this stuff as we have this conversation. So, as I alluded to, we have budget deadlines coming up both for the federal government and the state government. The federal government is currently operating under what's called a continuing resolution, and this has become common practice in recent years, where if Congress is unable to reach agreement on a full budget bills for the departments of the federal government, they oftentimes have passed what's called a continuing resolution, where they essentially continue federal government funding at current levels, or maybe with some adjustments in different areas, but a continuing resolution for a certain period of time in hopes that they will ultimately agree to a full budget. The current continuing resolution that they're operating under expires September 30th, which in a weird fate of circumstance for us here in Michigan, is the same time our current state budget is set to expire. But we'll get that into that in a minute. So Congress has been out on what is their August recess, which has traditionally been something that they do, where they're back in their districts in August meeting with constituents. We're seeing a little bit less of that, but they have not been in session in D.C. for the month. They are set to return next week. Obviously without a whole lot of time to get something done before September 30th. With Republican complete control of Congress and the presidency, there was a lot of expectation and hope from Republicans, especially at the beginning of the year, that they would pass full-blown budget bills and pass a full-blown federal budget by this time and be ready to do so. It certainly does not appear that that's going to be the case. And most advocates in Washington and experts that follow this will say that the only real likely outcome of this scenario is most likely another continuing resolution at some point, and perhaps the potential is certainly there for a federal government shutdown. We did see a federal government shutdown in the first Trump administration, first Trump presidency, and there's real concern and potential for that to happen again this time. So what's important to remember about this congressional battle that's shaping up, which is different from the last one that a lot of us were engaged in, and I know a lot of you listening were engaged in, around the reconciliation bill, is that in order to do anything on the budget side, so the continuing resolution and or full budget bills, they do need to meet that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. So that gives the Democrats in Congress obviously a lot more leverage if they're required to meet that 60 vote threshold. And so, that dynamic is certainly playing into this. And the real dynamic around this is that the Democrats are incredibly frustrated in Congress, and many of us feel rightfully so, but they're upset and frustrated about the reconciliation bill that was passed, certainly, but they're also, particularly in relation to this issue, upset about the rescissions packages that have been passed and that are being threatened. And this is really a direct affront to the appropriations process. And so what's happened is the majority in Congress, the Republicans in Congress, have passed. The latest one that got a lot of attention was around NPR and PBS public broadcasting and some foreign aid programs and other things. But this is essentially government funding that was agreed to in the last appropriations process. So this is something that was agreed to as part of a budget process for the federal government to fund. And then they came back, and under rescission, they can do it with a simple majority. They don't need the 60 vote threshold in the Senate. So they rescind funding that was essentially agreed to before. after that agreement is in place. And so that, the Democrats don't trust that they won't do that again. So the Democrats are hesitant to reach any budget agreement moving forward in Congress because the threat is there that the Republicans will just turn around and rescind anything that they didn't like in that agreement. And so that dynamic is particularly causing a lot of the trouble right now in Congress and leading a lot of folks to expect that we might be heading towards another federal government shutdown or a lack of an agreement there. So as I alluded to as well, similarly, the state budget is set to expire on September 30th, which sets Michigan up in a very unique position. Obviously, with both those things happening the same day. And the big important difference between the state process and the federal process is the state cannot operate under what's called a continuing resolution. The state is required by our Constitution to have a budget in place for our next fiscal year, and our next fiscal year begins October 1st. So the current state budget that we're operating under expires on September 30th. So if a new budget is not passed by midnight on September 30th, a state government shutdown will occur. Now, what does that actually mean? There's a lot of questions about, not a lot of history with. And unfortunately, I was involved in maybe one of the most recent times that was a part that happened. But that is the same scenario, obviously playing out at the state level. Now, what we've seen typically the time frame for a state budget is by July 1st, or the effort is done by July 1st to try to get a state budget in place for the next fiscal year, which won't start until October 1st, but in place by July 1st. We obviously have blown way past that, but at this point, all three of the legs of the stool, the governor, starts this process by presenting her budget proposal to the legislature. She did that back on, back in February, which is typical. The Senate then was a little bit delayed, but got their budget ultimately passed. Their versions of the budget passed through the Senate. And the House has really kind of been the holdup here. They did pass their education portions of the state budget back in July, but then just late yesterday afternoon, without a whole lot of notice to anybody, passed out the rest of the general fund department budget bills, or in one big budget bill through the House. So now at least all three of the players in this game here have passed or presented budgets to put out there on the table. Now, there's huge differences between the plans. There's even fairly significant differences between the governor's plan, obviously, who's a Democrat, and the Senate plan, which is controlled by Democrats, but they are vastly different, especially in totality. When you look at the education sides and the general fund sides, they are vastly different, those two, from where the House stands. And there's really a whole lot of uncertainty at this point of how these negotiations will play out. We're in a little bit of uncharted territory here, with it being this late in the game, the dynamics being what they are, and all of this playing out right now. There's not a lot of certainty on how things are going to play out. Stephen, can you go to the next slide, please? All right, so just a couple key points to know. I'll try not to editorialize too much here. I'd much rather hear from our panelists and try to get into where things stand and how we think this might play out. But I mean, one thing that's certain that's obvious to anybody who's involved in this process is broken. It's certainly broken at the federal level. It has been maybe for a while, but we're, at the state level as well. I can say, I mean, the one thing that's been constant really through the 25 years or more that I've been involved in state government and state legislative activity is that we've seen a slow evolution, which is now has to be almost complete, of more and more of the power and the decision making and all of the influence being shifted to the top leadership positions in the legislature, and individual legislators having less and less authority, opportunity, and really ability to really engage and impact this. This is certainly as evident as ever in what happened yesterday. Within an hour of it being released publicly, the House passed the entire general fund budget portion of the state budget. There was no opportunity for discussion, no opportunity for input from anybody outside of government, outside of the legislature, let alone even conversations or real debate or dialogue or opportunity for individual legislators to even engage on what was in this bill. And I know for a fact that every single legislator in that House that voted either yes or no for that bill did not know 10% of the details that were in that bill when they placed that vote. And that is, if nothing else, that is indicative of how broken this process is. And I think all of us as concerned citizens, certainly as advocates, have a role in figuring out a way that we can fix this process so that there is more opportunity, genuine opportunity for people to engage in the process. Let alone legislators, even individual legislators to engage in the process, but for the general public and for the advocates and for people who care about how their state government is spending money to be able to engage in the process. There just simply is not that opportunity right now, and that's broken. The other thing that's certain that's clear more than ever is that elected officials need to be held accountable. And this is across both parties. Here's the most frustrating thing, I think, from an advocacy standpoint that I'm hearing is that, you have Republican House members who voted for this bill yesterday that are already openly telling people, don't worry about it. It's not real. It's not really going to happen. Well, I mean, if they can get away with that, if they can vote for a terrible budget bill and then turn around and say it's not real, it's not going to happen, that's we're not going to fix the system unless there's some accountability, unless these things aren't done in that way and we have some different process in different ways and we actually as a citizenry hold people accountable for taking bad votes. The last thing I'll make the point of, and we'll reiterate this at the end, but the advocacy is now more important than ever. I know we've been asking a lot of our partners and the folks engaged with Michigan's children, certainly through that whole reconciliation fight and through all of this process to this point. But as we head up to both of these deadlines at both the federal and the state level, advocacy is now more important than ever. And so we thank you for joining us on this. Please share this, as Stephen said, with anybody you think might be interested. And hopefully you learn a little bit and hopefully we're able to answer any questions that folks might have. All right, Stephen, we want to jump on to the next slide. We can introduce our panelists here. So I'm very thankful and happy to be joined by three colleagues who really are experts on all of these issues or on these issues and on this process. And so I think we'll have a good discussion today. First, we have Brian Gutman, who's a Vice President, Public Policy and Government Relations with the Learning Care Group. We have Amy Zagman, the Executive Director of the Michigan Council for Maternal and Child Health, and Robert McCann, who's the Executive Director of the K-12 Alliance of Michigan. So, Brian, why don't we start with you? You can introduce yourself and maybe give us a little bit more detail and insight on what's happening, particularly maybe at the federal level and things we should be looking at.
Sure. Matt, thanks so much for the opportunity. Brian Gutman with Learning Care Group. We're the largest child care provider in Michigan. You would know us through a bunch of different brands. I'm not going to run through all that, but we'll assure you that we also do a lot of advocacy in Washington, D.C., where I happen to be sitting right now. Matt, I think you covered a lot of what I would have to add. Right now, we have a budget process where we know what the Senate is thinking, we know what the White House is thinking, and we don't know yet what the House is thinking. They are supposed to debate and potentially amend, likely pass the subsection of the budget that deals with childcare, labor, and other human service related policy the day after Labor Day. So we don't know how close or far apart these ideas are, but what we do know is, as Matt said, the ability to spend money by the federal government runs out at the end of September. A couple things I'll note on that, and Matt, some of these are things you referenced, others are not. One is that no one party fully controls the federal budget process. There is a 60-vote threshold in the Senate, which means that a deeply partisan budget simply will not go through without some Democrat support. Two, there was a lot of heartburn last year and a lot of internal dynamics around whether Democrats should or should not have supported the continuing resolution, the temporary spending authority that we are currently operating under. I imagine that for some members, that's going to influence whether they support another continuing resolution or not, if that's where we get. The last piece that I'll just note is this current federal governing configuration, the current White House, the current House leadership, and the current Senate leadership has shown a level of unpredictability and at times efficiency that is not what we typically see, regardless of which party is in control. And so while I think the most likely scenario that we're heading toward is the decision between a continuing resolution or a shutdown, I think we also have seen a willingness by Congress to pivot very quickly and very unexpectedly. And so I don't want to rule out the possibility that we could head into the last week of September without a budget, without even alignment on the budget, which in any other year would tell us there's either a shutdown or a continuing resolution. And we could end the week with a final budget. I don't think that we, under the current dynamics, can really predict a whole lot there. Matt, I'll pause there and turn it back to you.
No, that's, yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think you're right. The unpredictability is, I think, what scares us the most, right? To some extent. So maybe just remind people before we jump on to Amy as well. I mean, since we did live through this, I can't remember. I thought I want to say 17 days, maybe it was slightly longer, of a federal government shutdown during the previous Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the impacts of that if we do get to that scenario where come October 1st, there hasn't been agreement on this and we do see the federal government shut down?
Yeah. So it's a terrific question. It varies by the program, and I'll touch on a couple kind of big buckets of program types. But I don't think that we should underappreciate what the potential impact of a double shutdown would be, a federal shutdown on top of a state shutdown, which will vastly change this, which could vastly change this scenario. So if the federal government shuts down, you've got your essential services, essentially your emergency services, which continue to be funded. What we've seen in the past is that the determination of whether a service should continue to be funded, despite the shutdown, really hinges on the president. And it's the president, the executive budget office, that makes that determination, and might not be limited to the things that you or I would describe as an essential emergency service. You've got directly funded benefit programs. So think direct payment type programs where, unless they are deemed to be essential, the next round of checks are not going to go out to benefit people. You know, if you're talking about funding for something like SNAP benefits, food benefits, unless it's deemed essential, the next round of funding doesn't come out. And then you've got your block granted programs. And I'll highlight, because block granted programs, that funding is essentially preloaded. This is the area where I think the state budget environment could provide more noise than the federal budget environment. Ordinarily, we would say, hey, if this is block granted, states are prepaid for these services. They've got their ways of distributing those funds. And so the shutdown has to go on for a pretty long period of time before it starts disrupting the actual availability of services, because the states have money to live on for a while. If you have the double impact of a federal shutdown and a state shutdown, I don't know how that operates. I don't know that anybody knows how that operates. And that's where you might see, even if the funds exist at the state level, if those distributing offices at the state level are closed, whomever's administering that program, how does that money go out?
Yeah. No, I think that is exactly the uncertainty, and that nobody really knows. And I'm certain there's some scenario planning starting right now in the governor's office and others around that. But yes. All right, Amy, let's jump to you. And I'm going to unfairly put you on the spot because I know we're pouring through it right now as well. But why don't you jump in a little bit on to shift into the state side more on kind of the differences we're seeing emerge on the general fund side, on some of the programs that we all care about. Even, obviously the differences that emerged from the governor and the Senate, we've had a long time to process, but even based on some things you saw that came out of the House passed version yesterday.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Amy Zagman. I'm with Michigan Council for Maternal and Child Health. So obviously my focus is usually more like on the DHHS budget, but we do have watched with interest the school aid budget because of a number of items there. So in general terms, I would say Matt and Brian did a great job of laying out the level of dysfunction and unfortunately the similarities between what's going on at the federal level and what we're seeing at the state level as well. So to Matt's point, we are definitely trying to digest the House passed version of the omnibus budget that came out yesterday. So we've also known where they stand on school aid for a few weeks, and that was obviously a very sort of draconian approach to funding schools, where they sort of swept up many of the things that have been added over the years with regard to categorical funding and put it all in the per pupil allowance, really with not, frankly, a lot of thought to how some of those dollars are actually implemented, because it doesn't always work to do it through per pupil. But it's obviously, in my opinion, setting up a dynamic where they want to go into negotiations with the governor and with the Senate on a very different page in a very purposeful way. And so that was reiterated again with this passage of the other state departments' budgets and all rolled up into an omnibus budget late yesterday that we're reading through, probably as many as you are. I would say almost anything that isn't sort of nailed down in big lines in the DHHS budget, you can pretty much count on the fact that the House removed it. So many of the advancements that we've seen in the last couple of years with regard to the Healthy Moms, Healthy Babies initiative that the governor had, almost all of those items are sort of zeroed out in the House budget. Again, I think not because that may be where we end up, but that they want to stake out a place to go into negotiations with the Senate and the governor in what they consider to be, a strong position. I do think I agree with Matt that we need to speak up and speak loudly right now. I also think it can be overwhelming when you think about it, especially if you're looking at multiple budgets. If you're looking at multiple line items, it can be hard to prioritize what's most important for you. Don't let them do that to you. Don't let the chaos at the federal level, the chaos at the state level, the nonstop sort of policy changes you might be seeing, and then we come at you with everything you care about in the state budget is on the line. Don't let the overwhelm stop you from doing something. Identify, even if it's just one thing that you want to speak up about, and to Matt's point, hold people accountable. So, if they don't want to own this budget, they shouldn't have voted for it yesterday. So we need to be holding your own state representative accountable. And I think the unfortunate thing about the process is really to think about the fact that it's probably going to be a very small group of people in the end who are in the room making the final decisions. But we don't always know who those people are anymore, because to Matt's point, the process has become more and more dysfunctional over the years. It used to be that you could count on the subcommittee chairs being the ones in the room. That is not likely to be the case, in my opinion, this time. It's going to be very much a leadership conversation. There's going to be big items like the roads package thrown on the table along with the budget. And unfortunately, the people that we might have counted on to have detail about certain items, not necessarily going to be sitting at the table to defend those things. So we have to keep speaking up. We have to keep speaking loudly and making sure that, we are using some of those legislators who care about our issues to lean on the colleagues who are going to be at the table, because we have time. The good thing with the House coming out yesterday is now we've got 4 weeks, which in legislative terms, we can do a lot, damage or good, but a lot can be done. So we've got the time to put in. We just need to be really focused. And I think it's all the more important that you make sure that you're connected with a group like Michigan's Children, or we send out a weekly update just to know what are the most timely messages and who do we want to get those messages to most urgently.
Thanks, Amy. All right, Bob. Amy alluded to it. We've had a little bit more time to digest the House version of the education budgets, but why don't you walk us through kind of in a little bit more detail the major differences? I mean, it was a shock to a lot of us who have been involved in this for a while, the approach that was taken. But let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges and where you see maybe the fight being played.
Yeah, you kind of alluded to it earlier, Matt, that, normally when we see the House and the Senate and the governor introduce their budgets, the numbers are different, but largely the structure of those budgets is fairly similar in terms of how they are planning on sending that money out and through various categoricals. Someone alluded to it in the chat there about many of them that no longer exist in the House budget. And so not only have they missed the July 1st deadline to get the budget done, but they've really left, as I'm sure all of you know, everybody in a complete lurch about what a budget might even remotely look like once they finally get to negotiating one, just because of how fundamentally different each of them looks. And so it's really been, the superintendents that I work with, extraordinarily difficult for anybody to plan for the upcoming year. We've been talking quite a bit in the last few weeks about layoffs happening in schools, various programs that aren't being funded again. Certainly some districts have already or may be looking to end the free breakfast and lunch programs within their schools simply because they don't know if that money is available. So, as we look at where we're at right now, there's more unknowns than there are knowns in terms of where this is going to go. And if you look at what the House did just yesterday, and, I'm probably going to end up editorializing here.
That's all right.
I think ultimately what they did yesterday was performative. It was an act to show they were doing something because they are getting pressured for doing nothing. And so they rushed a budget out that, as Matt said, nobody had seen. Their own members hadn't seen it. Nobody knew what was in it. And yet within, an hour of it being revealed, it was already voted and done. And so now that we've had some time to digest what's in there, it's bad. It's a bad budget that would gut some significant funding from schools. I mean, just doing some rudimentary numbers of looking through it, it diverts over $2 billion out of the school aid fund. It would raise the MIPSERS payments that schools have to make. So on top of cuts, you're looking at probably another $500-600 million in costs that schools would be facing, which again is lost revenue that otherwise would be spent on programs and staffing. It's sort of a disaster of a budget. And the reason why it's so bad is really the same reason that I think this budget's been held up in a stalemate for so long. And that's simply because there isn't a priority on it. There is no priority particularly in the House leadership, I think, but I think there's been a lack of priority for a number of years now in Lansing in general in terms of prioritizing the school aid fund for what it's supposed to actually be used for. We've seen every year hundreds of millions of dollars get sent out of the school aid fund into the general fund to pay for other things. And when you look at what the Republicans passed yesterday in the House, it blows that number up even further. And the biggest piece of it is to pay for a roads plan that they don't have any other means of balancing a budget around other than taking about $800 million. It's in that ballpark somewhere. In money that comes into the school aid fund currently as a sales tax on gas and gets rid of the sales tax on gas completely, switches it to a straight per gallon gas tax that they can pay into the transportation fund instead. It's about an $800 million hit. They are promising a backfill in that money, but promises are only as good as they are on any given piece of paper in Lansing, and that piece of paper can be immediately thrown out and replaced with a new one that takes that money away again. So, unfortunately, that's been their priority. We've not only heard the speaker talk about a priority on getting a roads deal done, we hear the governor talk about it over and over again. So this isn't just one side doing this right now, and that's unfortunate for a lot of different reasons. But, the governor as recently as last week was saying there is no budget until there's a roads deal. And the only reason you would need to link a school aid budget with a roads deal is if you are trying to use it to pay for it. There is no other reason you would need to link those two together. We've seen various plans put on paper, not only in what they did yesterday, back on July 1st, the deadline to get a budget done, the House Republicans quickly tried to scramble a budget together again, this wasn't well thought out. It wasn't agreed upon by anybody, but that budget that they never actually introduced because their own members didn't want to vote for it, just specifically said that they were going to take $1.2 billion annually out of the school aid fund to put in what they called an education reserve fund. What is the education reserve fund? It doesn't say. It just simply says that the legislature can use it for whatever they want, which is a roads plan. They didn't say it. They weren't going to say it, but I said it quite often, very publicly, and no one ever said I was wrong. So I'm going to assume I was right. So, unfortunately, this has really been the crux of the problem for the last several months. It's ultimately been a problem for years, but most recently, this focus and unfortunate prioritization of trying to use school aid money to get a road funding deal done has really been what's caused the stalemate. And it's really been what's led to, yesterday's budget getting introduced, which is unequivocally a terrible budget for not only this year of public education in Michigan, but, really would set the precedent again that the school aid fund is little more than a piggy bank that the legislature can withdraw from whenever they want to pay for priorities that have nothing to do with the school aid fund. Taxpayers send money specifically to go to the school aid fund under the expectation that it's only going to be used for their schools. And unfortunately, that commitment hasn't held up here in Lansing. And so, overall, I would echo what some of the others here have said, that it's more important than ever that we are speaking out as education advocates, as supporters of our students, that what's going on right now is unquestionably wrong. As schools are reopening without any funding certainty for the year, that already has consequences on what's happening in our schools. It's already going to have many of those consequences be unfixable for the current school year. If you couldn't hire someone over the summer because you didn't know if you had the money, just because you get the money in September doesn't mean those people are still available to hire at that point. And so, unfortunately, the consequences, some of them are already unfixable for the year, but we know what we need to get done still. We know that the sooner we get a budget done, the better, and that allows schools to plan for the rest of the year better. But we also know that that budget can't just be any budget. We need to make sure that that budget puts every dollar that's meant for our classrooms into where they belong, and instead of, again, taking it and using it for other priorities. So the more of us that are speaking out right now, the better. And while, yes, it is very, very true that there's only a few people that are ultimately going to be making these decisions, which is not how a budget is supposed to work, as Matt knows very well from his time in the legislature. But that's unfortunately what the process has become. It's done behind the scenes. It's done, behind closed doors, and then poof, there's a budget and we're all voting on it. But every member of the legislature right now is frustrated with where the process is. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle are on. The rank and file members are hearing from parents. They're hearing from teachers that are frustrated that the schools are reopening. There has been any number of negative media articles about the legislature's failure to pass a budget and what the impact of that is on schools. It is making a difference. And the more frustrated that the rank and file members are getting with the process, that means the more they are talking to their leadership about their frustrations, and the more pressure that ultimately puts on them to get something done here. So, my overall, I wish I had a crystal ball and could tell anybody what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. Nobody knows, but the more all of us are speaking up and telling our local legislators what's happening in our schools, what the consequences are, and demanding action, that's what's ultimately going to break this logjam loose. So, my plea to all of you is be those advocates, be that voice.
Thanks, Bob. No, I couldn't agree more. And you made a number of points here. I want to just piggyback on a little bit. One, the idea about prioritization. I mean, we say always that. I mean, a budget is an exercise in prioritization, right? And it's an exercise for the legislators to prioritize where they think public tax dollars should be spent. And this part about, and the reason I emphasized holding them accountable was to that last point you made, that they ultimately are all going to have to vote on it, right? And for it to pass, more than half of them are going to have to vote yes. And if it's a bad deal, they need to be held accountable. They need to be made known that they will be held accountable before they vote yes on something. And so a couple other points you brought up that I'll kind of further maybe your editorialization on is, and one that's been important to this dynamic all the way through is this roads deal, right? And Michigan's Children's been out front wishing there was a whole lot more folks with us about saying why this focus on the roads. I mean, I understand the governor 6 years ago, whatever it was, 7 years ago, made this her priority when she ran. But come on, man, times are different. This is not it. And so if you look at it just from a pure political standpoint, right? What we have right now is divided government in Michigan, where there's three legs to the stool that have to figure this stuff out. Two of them are controlled by Democrats, one by Republican. Typically, in that scenario, the Democrats would have a major upper hand and the minority party, in this case the Republicans, would view themselves, so the House Republicans in this case would view themselves as kind of the gatekeeper. Don't let the Democrats get everything they want, but recognize that they're outnumbered in this negotiation. Well, that hasn't been the dynamic until now, and we're hoping it emerges as a dynamic, what I've talked about. But the dynamic up until now has been the governor siding with the House Republicans about why roads need to be a priority, and the Senate Democrats holding off and saying, no, that's not where we're at, and it's not a priority for us, and passing a good budget is much more of a priority. And so it's been the 2-to-1 has been kind of flipped on its head. Now, if that stays that way or not, we'll see. But as Bob said, as recently as last week, the governor was still talking about the need to do a roads plan. And the roads plan, if revenues were up and the economy was rolling and things were federal government funding in every area wasn't under fire, then we'd be much more quiet at Michigan's Children about prioritizing. We still wouldn't be thinking that roads should be the number one priority, but we'd be a little bit more quiet about it. But this is certainly not the time where we feel that anybody should be prioritizing road funding as the most important thing as we head into this final stages of these budget negotiations. So that's one. Another point, and this is a little bit more nuanced, and I want to get all you guys' feedback on this. So I made this point on another call I was on earlier today. So I hearken back to 20 whatever years ago when it was when we were in a similar dynamic politically, where I was in the House. We had just taken back control of the House as the Democrats. The Senate was controlled by Republicans, but Governor Granholm was the governor. So we had a 2-to-1 split, and that kind of that three-legged stool. The biggest difference in the dynamic was we had no money. We needed to raise revenues. We had been cutting budgets and cutting budgets and cutting budgets for years as a state. We knew that we needed to raise revenues. And it was a debate and negotiation about how much we were going to raise revenues, how much ultimate revenue the state should raise to be able to continue to fund budgets and move priorities. Where we ultimately, I think, were successful in that negotiation, ultimately, it took a long time and a lot of heartache and heartburn to get there, but we made it clear early on as House Democrats that we were willing to shut it down, that we weren't going to settle for less revenue than we thought we needed. And frankly, Governor Granholm, in her defense, I understand, she did not want to be the governor on whose watch the state government shut down. So she was eager and anxious to cut her deal back in the summer, and this time of year certainly, but even in July and August and heading up to this October 1 deadline, we held out as House Democrats and ultimately got the number real close to the number we were looking for, but we were willing to say, we don't care if it shuts down. We're not going to vote for a bad budget just because we're afraid of a government shutdown. I worry a little bit. So we've been, at Michigan's Children, I'll say this, we've been happy with the Senate Democrats' stance in large to this point about pushing back on the idea of roads, pushing back on we need to get a budget done just for a budget's sake, regardless of what it looks like. I worry that that willingness to say we're okay, that maybe unwillingness to say we're okay with the shutdown weakens their negotiating position as we head towards this deadline of September 30th. And so I'll take any input from any of you three about that dynamic and kind of thought process and as we head to this. I mean, it seems clear to me that the House Republicans, that even with the passage of that yesterday, are not real serious about getting something done here quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've heard Speaker Hall a number of times say, he's fine with shutting the government down in October. I mean, it almost seems everyone is assuming it's going to at this point. So it feels like we're just kind of going to drag this along through September with them pointing fingers at each other and blaming each other of why it's not done. I mean, I'm looking at social media right now, and that's exactly what we're looking happen as the Senate Dems and House Republicans are yelling at each other on Twitter. About what was passed yesterday. But your point about the the prioritization, what we've tried to do is really emphasize the fact that this idea that roads are people's biggest priority is simply wrong. We commissioned a group called the Glengarriff Group, who is a political pollster that does a lot of polling in Michigan, to do a survey of Michigan residents and actually figure this out. Like, where are your priorities and how, what are their feelings about public education funding? And what it showed was that when you ask them simply which is a bigger priority for you, school funding or road funding, nearly 80% of Michigan voters said school funding was a bigger priority for them. And then when you started asking them, would you be okay with using school aid money to pay for a roads plan? I believe, if I don't have the data in front of me, but I think it was 89% said no. And find me anything that 89% of Michigan residents agree on. And yet this is one of those, and yet we're seeing the legislature do the exact opposite. And that's before the pollster sent me the results, he called me and just laughed, and he said, I don't think I've ever seen an idea this unpopular with people in the state of Michigan, and yet this is their priority that they're pushing. So, I think all of us need to be emphasizing the fact that they're just wrong here, that roads aren't Michiganders' priorities. It's schools. They want their schools to be successful. They want their kids to have the services that they need. And this is exactly what's harming that right now, is not only this ongoing stalemate that's happening and getting them their budget, but the priorities that people are putting on the table right now in their budgets is misguided.
Yeah.
Matt, one of the pieces that I think is certainly at play, I think there's been a lot of evidence of it at play at the federal level, and I am concerned that it is also at play at the state level, is the actual or perceived mandate from elected officials to reduce government spending. And at the federal level, what we saw early on in the administration, DOGE efforts, right? Now, some people supported it, some people opposed it. But if your goal was to reduce federal spending, then it was not a terribly ineffective way to disrupt. We saw the same with just refusing to distribute funds and rescission packages, and that has festered distrust on both sides of the aisle for congressionally mandated spending. And I think that there's a similar dynamic that may be at play at the state level. If the goal is a smaller budget, and I have heard Speaker Hall say that this budget, I've heard him say several times, this budget will be smaller than the last budget. If that's your ultimate goal, then a shutdown is not inherently bad. And I think that that's a really significant difference from past cycles, where while everyone at the table might have different priorities and different preferred spending levels, and some certainly said the size of government, whether it's state or federal, is too large, and I want to rein that in, the ultimate goal was an efficient and operating government around whatever shared priorities there were. I'm not convinced that dynamic is at play. And if I play this forward a little bit and say, okay, one or both shut down on October 1, what then gets it to open back up? Who are the elected officials who are comfortable perhaps with a shutdown because it does reduce spending? Who are they going to listen to around pressure to reopen, and what are the parameters that they would set for a reopening? And I get really quickly, deeply uncomfortable about where I suspect those answers go.
I think you hit on, Brian, the similarity again between what's going on at the federal level and the state level. I think the other dynamic is just some of the personalities involved, and that they seem to be sort of borrowing from the playbook of the president. And I think there's some difficulty here, certainly based on some of the quotes that some of House leadership have put out, that they don't seem to necessarily care that there might be pain felt even by their own constituents. And so I think you're right. I think there's a lot more interest in the soundbite, a lot more interest in sort of, we heard it yesterday from the House Appropriations Chair, she echoed the fraud, waste, and abuse, and yet there's nothing to indicate in any of the budget hearings I watched that there was really an actual focus on fraud, waste, or abuse. They just assign that name to things that they don't appear to like. They're playing to I think the overwhelm that everyone is feeling, and then they're playing to the sound bites and echoing a lot of the national playbook, which I think is incredibly problematic. We will have a smaller budget. Unfortunately, we'll have a smaller budget because the federal government is drastically cutting back what we're going to receive. And so there is going to have to be hard conversations, but we're not even seeing a real seriousness around trying to mitigate the harm that's going to be felt by people, because I just don't sense from at least leadership. I don't think this is true of all rank and file members, but there doesn't seem to be a real understanding of the role of government and the need to fund government in a way that sustains things that matter to people. All you got to do is look at the quotes from yesterday about holding hospitals accountable for their political action, and it'll be okay if they go out of business. I don't know about anyone else here, but it's not okay with me if the hospital in my area goes out of business, because at some point, unfortunately, many or all of us will need that hospital to be in business. And the idea that just is said so casually, I think should be alarming to all of us. And whether we can prevail upon leadership to have some empathy and some understanding and some grasping of that, I'm with Robert. Like, at the very least, we should be leaning on those rank and file members who should be hearing about how those things are impacting their local level and how they would impact your lives and your work, so that hopefully in the end, they aren't just given the final budget with an hour to vote on it, never having read it. I mean, that isn't going to fly in a few weeks when we get down to it, or at least I hope it won't.
I agree. And I think your earlier points, especially, I mean, this whole thing is fueled by the political reality that these elected Republicans are much more fearful of the right than they are of losing a general election. We used to target, competitive general election seats and thinking we could move. There is not a single Republican maybe elected in America right now that's more concerned about their general election race than they are about what's coming from the right if they look like they're not towing this line. And that's the political dynamic that's not unique to Michigan, that's infected this country, that we have to figure out. But that's just real. Now, your point, I made this point about the hospitals because I saw that quote yesterday too. And I'll say this, I might be as cynical as anybody on this panel and maybe on this call, but I am not cynical enough to believe that for a second, if one of these rural hospitals closes, whether it's through the actions of the Republicans at the federal government or the actions of Republicans at the state government, any Republican is going to have a hard time getting elected in rural Michigan if the hospital in that community closed, and it's viewed as because they wanted to cut government funding and they didn't think hospitals were important. And so, that's where I think the opportunity is there with the rank and file to say, hey, and I'll say this, I mean, we all fought and were very disappointed when that reconciliation bill passed, but we did succeed in pushing off a lot of the really negative pieces on the Medicaid and the SNAP to much further because of the pressure that built on a lot of these Republicans, elected Republicans at the federal level, not necessarily from Michigan, or obviously not from Michigan, but from other states that were concerned and were hearing from their constituents about the impact of these cuts on their communities and how this would impact their jobs and their families and their communities and their kids. And so, I mean, that's what we need to do now. We need to focus on these legislators so that they know that we're watching them and we're ready to hold them accountable, and we're expecting them to pass a budget that prioritizes the things that their constituents want. And I think, I think that's the unfortunate reality, Amy, is that the political realities are right now, they're much more afraid of the tweets and the getting on the wrong side of whoever is viewed as, the Trump team than they are focused on what they should be prioritizing. All right. Any questions anybody has? We can give you a few more minutes of your lunchtime back here. I know people appreciate that, but if you have any questions, you can jump on them now. Just or just drop them in the chat. And as Amy said, and Robert too, and Brian, we're certainly still pouring through what passed out of the House yesterday. We'll be engaged in monitoring these conversations and hopefully negotiations, hopefully some real negotiations that start soon. And we'll certainly keep people as updated as we can through this process on where we think the real opportunities are. But I would say it is undoubtedly so that from now until the end of September, this is a time. And like Amy said earlier, don't get overwhelmed. Pick the one issue that's most important to you and reach out on that one. Pick, maybe one or two that you care about that would be impactful to either your family or your community, and reach out to your legislators on those ones.
Hey, Matt, I got to jump off the call here. I apologize, but the last thing I'll say is to emphasize Amy's point about some of the political direction the House leadership is using here. They put a long statement out right after they passed the budget yesterday and signed it off with "Thank you for your attention to this matter," which obviously is the exact same language our president signs things off with. So
yeah,
there's no seriousness to a lot of what's going on here. It's political theater, and it's unfortunately impacting our kids right now. And we should all be demanding better than that, regardless of our political affiliations. This process should be better than that. But I apologize, I have to jump off, but thanks for having me and letting me share some thoughts, Matt.
Thanks, Robert. We'll be in touch. I see from Rebecca, yes, there is a breakdown, and we're actually working on a budget basics that'll do a comparison level document that'll have what the House passed, what the Senate passed, what the governor proposed on all of these things. That should be available soon. But we'll get that available on our website, and we can even share it out with everybody who's registered here on this Lunch and Learn. Any other questions, everybody? Well, thank you. And I know it's been a long, I guess, spring, maybe even winter, spring, summer, now fall, right here. But we're going to ask you to keep at it, keep going, and please use us. Brian's organization and Amy's organization as well. We're going to try to do all that we can to put resources out there to make it easy for folks to get engaged and to let their elected officials know what they think should be the priorities in this budget process. All right. Thanks, everybody.